Good afternoon. Hey, everybody. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research here at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture, which is one of our 140th anniversary signature programs. Our speaker today, Avalyn Hunter, is a nationally recognized authority on thoroughbred pedigrees and racing history, whose work has appeared in the Blood Horse, Thoroughbred Times, Owner Breeder International, Market Watch, New York Breeder, and Louisiana Horse. She's the author of Dream Derby, The Myth and Legend of Black Gold, American Classic Pedigrees, 1914 to 2002, The Kingmaker, How Northern Dancer Founded a Racing Dynasty, and Gold Rush, How Mr. Prospector Became Racing's billion-dollar sire. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you all for your welcome. I hope you will not hold me and my Tennessee accent in too much contempt for having ventured over the border. I actually live down in Florida these days and have for about the last 30 years. So I'm from the other end of horse country. I'm not that far out of Ocala. But the Kentucky Oaks is something that I started to research because I realized there had been so little said about the Kentucky Derby sister race. The Kentucky Oaks is the second oldest continuously run race in the country. It kicked off only 2 days after the Kentucky Derby did, so it's been run continuously since 1875. Can anyone in this audience tell me who the first winner was? Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment here. Now, for those of you who've studied or suffered through American history, as the case may be, you may know that General John Burgoyne was the British loser at the Battle of Saratoga. He was, however, quite a distinguished person. He had a long military career. He was instrumental in developing British light cavalry, and he was also a successful playwright. He was related by marriage to the Earls of Derby. And at a dinner party given by his nephew, the 12th Earl of Derby, he proposed that Derby should sponsor a race for 3-year-old fillies to basically test the mothers of the breed. At that time, thoroughbreds were very much in demand for cavalry use as well as for racing. So being an old military man, General Burgoyne was obviously thinking about the possibility that some of the offspring of the fillies in question would end up being cavalry mounts for officers and might save their masters' lives by their strength, speed, and courage. Lord Derby took the suggestion, and the inaugural Oak Stakes ran at 1775, and Lord Derby also won it with his filly Bridget. Now, nearly a century later, Meriwether Lewis Clark inaugurated the Kentucky Derby. He did this modeled on the Derby Stakes in England, and he also modeled the Oak Stakes after the Oak Stakes in England. The first winner, as you can see on the slide, Vinaigrette. She defeated 5 other fillies and won $1,175 for her effort, and that's about all we know of her because she kind of faded into history at that point. But the Oaks was off. A few years later, the Great Interstate Derby took place. This was Lord Murphy out of Tennessee, Falsetto out of Kentucky, and this was one day when the volunteer state took the day. Wouldn't have that happening today because Tennessee's breeding industry is about non-existent, while of course Kentucky is the center of the thoroughbred world at this point. But in that day, they were pretty serious rivals, both for horse racing and for their distilleries. Liatuna won the Kentucky Oaks, upholding the honor of the volunteer state. And for those people who hung around for both races, I'm pretty sure there were some pretty serious hangovers and some pretty serious debates regarding the merits of Kentucky whiskey versus Tennessee product. Now, you may have noticed on Liatuna's portion that she's depicted with a black jockey, but no name is given. This was pretty commonplace in the newspapers and things covering the time. There were many, many fine black jockeys that rode at that time, And usually you just see a name in the, like Hightower or Burroughs, just a surname or perhaps a nickname. John Stovall was one of the early ones who was actually recorded by his full name and received recognition as actually being a person. He won the Kentucky Oaks a record 3 times, and he also rode in the Derby several times and finished 3rd twice. Unfortunately, he was killed at Gravesend up in New York in 1900 while he was exercising a horse, and he was pretty much forgotten, even though in his day he was a very well-known rider here. Of course, the greatest of all the black jockeys that rode during that time period was Isaac Murphy. He won the Oaks only once, and this was with Modesty. Modesty was the first filly to be named a 3-year-old champion that had raced in the Oaks. She also won the inaugural American Derby under Murphy's handling and won several important races up in New York. Murphy was really pretty much America's first superstar athlete. He was well known all over the racing world. He was welcome at Saratoga as well as Churchill Downs. He rode all the big races that were in this area at the time. But unfortunately, he was in a pretty difficult position. He was well known, he was well liked, but as a black man, a generation after slavery, he was in the position of having influence but no real power. And he had to be careful about what he said and did because he was dependent on the white men who owned most of the horses that he rode for being able to continue to ride. He also unfortunately had a great deal of trouble maintaining his weight. In that day and time, the methods for dieting and reducing were pretty drastic, and many jockeys died of tuberculosis and pneumonia because their bodies were weakened by the constant stress. Murphy was among the victims. He rode his last winter in late 1895 and died 3 months later. On the training side of the house, Edward Dudley Brown, who was known as Brown Dick, was one of the greatest figures of his time. He got his nickname because he was marked out as a potential jockey as a boy, and he and the other young boys that were being trained as potential jockeys would get in foot races with each other. Brown was so fast that it was joked that he could beat Brown Dick. That was a famous 3-mile racehorse back in the day, and the nickname stuck. That's what he was known as for the rest of his life among his friends. He trained 3 Kentucky Oaks winners and was co-owner of the last one, Etta, which makes him also the last black man to have owned a Kentucky Oaks winner until 1991. That's when the Burrell family won with Light Light. And you may have heard of the most famous member of the Burrell family by another name, MC Hammer. Unfortunately, while Brown was a wealthy man because of his skill in selecting and selling blood stock and in training, his wealth drained away due to medical problems and just too many loans made to friends who didn't pay him back. And he died of pneumonia in 1906. It took a while for him to get the honors he was due, but he is now a member of the Racing Hall of Fame, and there is a state historical marker number 2027 that was erected to his memory in 1999. He was also a great gentleman and well known for his kindnesses to women and children. He loved to have them tour his stables and to answer all of their questions, and they said he was as courtly as a cavalier at the court of King Charles. Great gentleman. Blacks did continue to play an important role in Kentucky Oaks history and on up into the early 20th century, but unfortunately, the 1880s were probably the heyday of black riders in the United States. By 1890, I'm getting a century ahead of myself. You had an increasing amount of racial prejudice driving them out. The reason, ironically enough, was Murphy's success was so famous and the reports of his income were so great that it drew in an influx of young riders who wanted to get in on the gravy train. And the white ones realized that by making use of prejudice and some pretty dangerous riding tactics, they could intimidate and crowd out their competition, which they proceeded to do. Those owners and traders that were still willing to ride black jockeys, unfortunately, were also intimidated because the gang tactics meant that their horses risked serious injury if they put a black jockey up on them. And so black jockeys were eventually simply squeezed out of the sport. You probably know that in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision came down that legalized segregation in the United States. There was simply no place segregated for black owners, trainers, and jockeys to go in horse racing. It was either, if they couldn't remain, out they went. Jimmy Lee, who's shown in this photograph, was the last black rider to win the Kentucky Oaks. He rode Wingting, and just 3 days earlier, he had swept all 6 races on the Churchill Downs card. He was being celebrated as being the next Murphy. And 7 years later, he died penniless. Now, in this time period, Churchill Downs wasn't doing too hot either. In fact, the track was facing bankruptcy by 1902. The person who saved him was Matt Wynn, who many of you may have heard of. He owned in partnership a tailor shop here in Louisville. He had no experience at all in racetrack management, but he had 2 things going for him. He loved the Kentucky Derby. It was his passion and romance, and he had a lot of experience in sales and marketing. He was brought in pretty much in a last-ditch effort to save the Downs by Charles Price, who was the track secretary at the time. And Price told him, "You're the last person I know who I can go to. If you don't do something to help the track will die and the Derby will die with it." And he knew about his friend's obsession. When agreed, he organized a syndicate to take over the Churchill Downs, and he began nursing the plant and races back to life. And that is why we still have a Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks today. Wynn was mostly interested in resurrecting the Derby, but the Oaks kind of rode around on Big Brother's coattails. And it started to do a bit better too. And by a couple of decades into the century, you started seeing high-class fillies in it again. The filly you see in this photograph is probably one you're not familiar with. Her name was King's Daughter, but she was an extremely talented and popular performer in her day. Not quite championship class, but she raced all over the eastern United States. And I believe she made over 100 starts and won over 30 of them. She was a pretty hardy girl. She was one of 4 Oaks winners trained by Thomas McDowell, who had 4. What makes McDowell really unique in Oaks history is that he was the first person to be the breeder, the owner, and the trainer of the same horse going in there. And he did it twice, both with King's Daughter and with Rush. He also did the same triple with Avalyn in the Kentucky Derby, and he's the only man to accomplish that feat in both races. He was the most dominant owner in Oaks history until Calumet Farm came along. These are a couple of the top fillies that appeared in the race during the decade of the 1910s. Sunbonnet was accounted the filly champion of her year. Kathleen, who I don't have a picture of, was the 1960 Oaks winner. She was also accounted a national champion. And Water Blossom, who you see to the lower left, was a very good filly who won the Oaks and also won the Alabama Stakes up in New York, and probably would have been accounted for the champion if it weren't for a filly named Regret, who won the Derby that year. Now, between the wars, of course, you can see from the graph that there's a major dip, and that, of course, was the Great Depression. This was an era during which female owners started becoming much more prominent in racing. Up to this time, most owners had, if they were women, raced in their husbands' names. They didn't really race much in their own. There were some exceptions, particularly the further west you went, away from the Eastern elite. Helen Hay Whitney owned Green Tree Stable and was the first woman to own a Kentucky Oaks winner, which she did in 1923 with Untidy. And as you can see from the slide, there were a couple of other prominent owners named. This was also the era where, if you're familiar with Kentucky Derby history, you know that the second woman to breed and own an Oaks winner did so in 1924. That was Rosa Hoots, who was the owner and breeder of Black Gold, and the first woman to be both the breeder and owner of a Derby winner. And this was the lady who won the Oaks in the same year that Black Gold won the Derby 100 years ago. Princess Doreen won the Oaks by disqualification. It's the only time it's happened. The first place horse was a filly named Glide. She finished in front by about 2 lengths, but she was set down for interference in the stretch. Princess Doreen inherited the win. As it turned out, Princess Doreen was one of the great champions of the turf. She raced against males pretty routinely, whipped them a pretty fair number of times, and she is the earliest Oaks winner to have been put into the National Museum of Racing in 1982. Now, there are other Oaks winners that went into the Hall of Fame before she did, but they were later winners of the Oaks. She is the earliest to have actually made it in herself, but she was an incredible mare, great weight carrier. And many years later, her great-granddaughter, Brown Bess, was the Eclipse Award winner as champion turf female. These are several other of the top fillies that competed during the 1920s. Black Maria was a great champion in her own right, 3 times considered the best of her sex in the United States. Easter Stockings in the middle was the best runner sired by Sir Barton, the first Triple Crown winner. And she defeated the Derby winners, Whiskery and Clyde Van Dusen, during her career. And down at the bottom, you see Rose of Sharon, who won 4 different Oaks stakes, the Kentucky Oaks and 3 others, and defeated good colts in the Potomac Handicap. Those of you who are familiar with the career of Man of War know that he won one of his greatest races in the Potomac, carrying 138 pounds to victory. And in the Potomac, Rose of Sharon beat a field of pretty good colts. The only one that year that she was not considered better than was Blue Larkspur, who was the champion of that year. Unfortunately, by the time you get into the early 1930s, the Great Depression was taking its effect, and the purses got slashed for the Derby. This was happening all over the Midwest, so Wynn was in kind of the same boat as all the track operators from Chicago down to New Orleans. But the Oaks really took a hit on it. It sank to 25,000 in value. It didn't reach 10,000, added again until after World War II. And because of this, some of the high quality fillies that might have been drawn in to compete stayed in New York or stayed in Chicago, where the purses were better. The mare shown in this picture is Alcibiades. She was a noted broodmare for the Headley family. She won the Oaks in 1930. She also raced in Gallant Fox's Derby that year, but finished up the track in 10th after leading early. The 1936 winner, Two Bob, was a real bargain for Calumet Farm. She had raced for Sonny Whitney, actually, and won the Oaks for him. But to tell you where the status of the Oaks was at that point, Two Bob ended up in a $4,500 claiming race and was taken by Mrs. Emil Denmark. Later on, Warren Wright paid Mrs. Denmark the same $4,500 she'd claimed the mare for. So she got her money back out of the deal, and Calumet got a mare that became a great foundation mare for them, and threw 3 stakes-willing fillies, including Thule, who was a top filly of the late 40s and early 50s. So when you get to mid-century now, you know, as I've mentioned Calumet a couple of times, they are now about to become the dominant player in the story. But before we get to Calumet, you have Herbert Wolf, who was breeding horses in, of all places, Kansas, just south of Kansas City. He had Wolford Farm. And he was associated with a trainer named Ben Jones. If that name sounds familiar, it should. They won the Derby with Lauren in 1938, and that's where you have this photograph. showing them being congratulated by Governor Happy Chandler. Wolf is to the left, standing next to the governor. Eddie Arcaro's in the middle, familiar name there, I'm sure. And Ben Jones is over there to the right, looking pretty jolly. The filly that Wolf won with was Lassie. She was a full sister to Lauren, and that is the only time in Derby and Oaks history that a full brother and sister have won the signature races for their respective sexes. And then up in the upper left here, you see Warren Wright and his wife, Lucille Parker Wright. They were the owners of Calumet. And they simply dominated American racing in the 1940s and 1950s. There has never been another outfit in American racing that did what Calumet did. After Wright's death, his widow married Admiral Jean Markey, and they eventually had what they called the Calumet Renaissance that began in the mid-70s. Calumet Farm is the leading producer of Oaks winners. They had 6. And the mare that you see in the photograph kind of in the center and down, that's Blue Delight. Warren Wright bought her in a package of 8 mares. He only wanted the one, and she was the one he actually wanted. And he bred 3 Oaks winners from her. No other mare has ever produced so many. She was a daughter of Blue Larkspur. And what he was trying to do was replicate the same cross that had made his great filly Twilight Tear, who was also out of a Blue Larkspur mare and by the Calumet Farm stallion, Bull Lee. And these are Blue Delight's daughters. Real Delight, the 1952 Oaks winner, was the best of them. She was the champion 3-year-old filly of her year and a great foundation mare whose female line led to Alydar. Said Bubbly was her full sister. She won the following year. And then Princess Turia, who was their half-sister by the stallion Heliopolis, she had a set of pretty twisted up legs under her, and it took the wizardry of the Jones brothers to get her to race at all. But she was an extremely talented mare. She did win the Oaks in 1956. And later on, she produced a colt called Forward Pass, who won the Preakness in his own right, and also won the Kentucky Derby on the disqualification of Dancer's Image. That was a very famous case that I'm sure a lot of you have been aware of. And then from Calumet, we go to Cane Hoy. And the reason that this stable had its rather unusual name is that Mr. Guggenheim, who you see in the far left of this picture, who owned the stable, simply liked the pronunciation of the words cane hay in the gala dialect of the Carolinas. And so he named his stable Cane Hoy, which simply because he liked the sound of it. Perhaps it also kind of fit in with his naval background since he had also been a naval officer. The jockey in the center is Manuel Yacaza. He was one of the early Latino riders to come in, and he could ride. His hero was Eddie Arcaro. He could ride like Arcaro, but he also had a temper, and when he was in the heat of competition, he could make Arcaro look like a choir boy. He racked up several hundred days in suspensions during his career, but he and Guggenheim got along quite well, and so did the third gentleman here, Woody Stevens, who's one of the most legendary trainers of the second half of the 20th century. Woody Stevens is the co-holder of the Oaks record for wins by a trainer with 5. The other person who co-holds that mark is D. Wayne Lucas. He got there in 2022 with Secret Oath. Yacaza rode 4 Oaks winners, so among jockeys, he's tied with Eddie Arcaro as the most successful in that department. Now, what really started to have the Oaks taking off was when it got kind of tied in to the whole feminist movement. And so 1962 winner, Cicada, just a tough filly. Her stablemate, Sir Gaylord, Secretariat's half-brother. He was the Derby favorite, and he broke down the morning of the Oaks. By that time, the filly had already had her feed drawn. She knew she was scheduled to race, and also her favorite jockey, Bill Shoemaker, was committed to another horse in the Derby. So Meadow Stable decided that they'd better just keep Cicada in the Oaks, and she went ahead and won it. She ended up being an American champion 3 times. She was not a very successful broodmare, unfortunately, but the filly she beat was another story. Flaming Page belonged to E.P. Taylor up in Winfield's Farms. You probably know him better as the breeder and owner of Northern Dancer. But Flaming Page won the Queen's Plate and the Canadian Oaks after her second in the Kentucky Oaks, and she became the dam of the last English Triple Crown winner, Nijinsky II. And he was a great stallion who stood at Claiborne Farm, just, about 60, 70 miles over to y'all's east. Now, in 1965, we have another landmark because Mary Kime became the first and so far the only woman to train an Oaks winner. She was a registered nurse and she took out her trainer's license after she got torqued with a trainer who didn't show up for work one morning. She sacked him, interviewed a few other candidates, decided she could do the job better herself, and got her trainer's license. She is the only trainer in American history to have won as her maiden victory as a trainer, a stakes race. She did that with Clempack and the Sheridan Stakes. She was going to train Clempack with the Derby in mind, but the horse was injured and never ran in it. But in 1965, she trained a Maravan to an upset win, and that year she also had the 6th place finisher in the Kentucky Derby, Mr. Pack. 5 years later, she played a role in another landmark. She named Diane Crump to ride Mary Indian at Hialeah Park. She was the first owner or trainer to name a woman to ride a horse at a major track in North America. Unfortunately, Mary Indian didn't draw into the race that day, so she can't take the glory for giving Diane Crump her actual first ride. That went to Tom Calumet a few days later. But Kime kept kind of mentoring Crump. And a year later, Crump made Derby history by becoming the first woman to ride in the race. She was on the long shot Fathom and finished about where expected, but you can't blame her for that. If you don't have the horse under you, the jockey isn't going to outrun that field. But Kime remained a champion of women's participation in the sport and remained active in the sport until 1988 when she died. Dark Mirage, shown here with her regular exercise rider, Tuesday Testa, and her trainer, Everett King, she was so small that the people in the barns used to joke about when they set out mouse traps that someone was going to catch the filly instead of the mice. But she could run. When she went in the Kentucky Oaks, Walter Bloom, I think, was up on Miss Ribbit. They were making a stretch run and something whipped by him so fast he couldn't read the saddlecloth number to see what had passed him. It was Dark Mirage, and she was on her way to a 4.5 length victory with Manny Yakaza up. She went on to win the Triple Tiara Series in New York. She was unbeaten for the remainder of the year and gained the nickname of the Tiny Tigress. Before Ruffian, there was Dark Mirage. She won the Acorn race by 6 lengths in track record time. She won the Mother Goose Stakes, the second of the Tiara, by 10 lengths. And she won the Coaching Club American Oaks by 12 lengths. She was so impressive winning the Oaks that the fans at Aqueduct were standing up and just doing a very rhythmic clap, 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 in time to her hoofbeats as she came down the stretch. They do that very seldom. Kelso received a similar tribute, winning the Jockey Club Gold Cup for the 5th time. That's how impressive she was. She was so dominant that they were thinking that even with Dr. Fager having a heck of a year in 1968, that she might be a Horse of the Year candidate. But she got hurt. She was put on the sidelines from August on. The following year, she won her first start out with a stake in California. Then the second one, another horse slammed into her. She ended up dislocating a sesamoid, and complications of the injury forced her to be put down 4 months later. Fred Hooper, the pride of Florida. He was a maverick. He's the son of a Georgia farmer, and his first thing besides handling his dad's plow horses was he got a shipment of Mustangs in from Montana at the age of 14 and broke them. fortunately without getting broken himself. He made his money in construction, and he had pretty much his own ideas of how to do things. His 1961 Oaks winner, My Portrait, was the only one to have been bred in the state of Alabama. He had Circle H Ranch at that time that was just outside of Montgomery. And then he moved to the Ocala area for his Hooper farm. And that's where he bred Susan's Girl, who you see here, as well as her half-sister, Quay's Quilt, who won the race a few years later. Susan's Girl was a right tough filly. She raced from coast to coast, a dead honest mare, and won 3 American championships in her own right. Ruffian never raced in the Kentucky Oaks. Perhaps the most famous mare to race in the United States until Rachel Alexandra and Zenyatta came along. But she became an icon, really, of the feminist movement of that time. She drew the attention of a lot of women and girls into racing. I'm sure most of you are aware that she lost her life in that tragic match race against Foolish Pleasure. She was leading at the time and snapped a leg. That fragility was bred in from her sire, who broke legs 3 times during his racing and stud careers, and the 3rd time proved fatal. While her death was a great tragedy, the attention it drew to racing for fillies and mares, as well as women's participation in the sport, it resulted in filly races getting a lot more attention than they had previously, and that included the Kentucky Oaks. However, the Kentucky Oaks in winter for year didn't benefit from that, because since Ruffian wasn't there, folks considered it kind of a yawner. Her owner was so unimpressed by the whole thing that he actually left the stands before the Oaks ran to go to the Kentucky Derby party. This was part of the Calumet Renaissance here, Devona Dale. She was named for a character in one of Admiral Markey's novels. She did the unprecedented. She swept the old filly Triple Crown, which was the Kentucky Oaks, the Pimlico Oaks, or Black-Eyed Susan Stakes, and the Coaching Club American Oaks, and the New York Triple, which was the Acorn Stakes, the Mother Goose, and the Coaching Club American. She did that in 1979, was named the champion of her year. Bold and Determined would have been the champion of her year, except for a miss named Genuine Risk, who was the 2nd filly to win the Kentucky Derby. The two met during the 1980 Masquette Stakes. It was an incredibly thrilling race, very tight, where Bold and Determined passed Genuine Risk in the stretch, and Genuine Risk came back on her, and it took the photo finish camera to separate them at the end. Bold and Determined won. She actually won 6 Grade 1 stakes that year, where Genuine Risk won only 2. But Genuine Risk had the Derby. She'd run 2nd against the Colts and the Belmont and the Preakness, and she was awarded the championship. So Bold and Determined was probably one of the best fillies to have won the Oaks, but tough luck. It's kind of hard to go up against a Derby winner. And this was Princess Rooney, who is the 1983 winner. She distinguished herself as champion older filly in 1984. That year was the year of the inaugural Breeders' Cup, and some of you may remember the 3-horse duel that was fought out in the Classic between Wild Again, Gate Dancer, and Slew of Gold. Princess Rooney won off in the Distaff, which at the time was run at the same distance as the Classic, and ran it faster than the boys did, and she was winning for fun. So we're getting to the modern area. And if I say think pink, it's because pink is now kind of the official color of the Kentucky Oaks. And you'll hear a little bit more about why about that shortly. Sonny Whitney, campaign for Kentucky Oaks winner. Remember what I said about the owner who stepped out on his Oaks winning filly, not even seeing her race? That was him. He dispersed his racing stable before his death in 1992. He was thinking that his wife wouldn't want to be burdened with it. Mary Lou Whitney thought otherwise. She started scouring farms around the place for mares that carried the old Whitney bloodlines, and her work was rewarded when her filly Birdtown won the 2003 Kentucky Oaks and became champion 3-year-old filly. her half-brother Birdstone was the spoiler in Smarty Jones' Triple Crown bid. And the mare that she bred the two from, Dear Birdie, became Broodmare of the Year. Mrs. Whitney remained involved in racing till her death and was named the First Lady of the Oaks in 2015. And here is the greatest of all the Oaks winners, Rachel Alexandra. She made a spectacle out of what was supposed to be a horse race. She won by over 20 lengths. Calvin Burrell was just a passenger on board, and after the race, when Donna Brothers jogged up and interviewed him, he said, "I think we had her in the wrong one." As you know, a couple of weeks later, she went up against the Derby winner, Mind That Bird in the Preakness, and beat him. So apparently Burrell knew what he was talking about. The shame of that year was that there was never a meeting between Rachel Alexandra and the great older mare Zenyatta. So which was the better? You decide for yourself. Rachel Alexandra was unbeaten in 2009, as was Zenyatta. Rachel Alexandra won the Haskell Invitational against 3-year-old males and beat the tar off the Belmont winner, who became the champion 3-year-old male of the year. She won the Woodward against older males, the first filly or mare to do so, and then was retired for the season. Zenyatta went on to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. It was a great year. 2009 was also when NBC Sports started covering the Kentucky Oaks. And that's where you started having the coverage by Donna Brothers. You've seen her on the track interviewing jockeys post-race. That's when that started. It was also the year that Churchill Downs partnered with the breast cancer charity Susan G. Komen for the Cure and Horses and Hope. And since then, they have the annual Survivors Parade walking the track before the Oaks every year to celebrate the victories of those who have defeated breast cancer and other female diseases, and to honor the victims who have died. And this is also where the tradition of pink being the color of the day at Churchill Downs became associated with the Oaks. And that's because of the association of the color pink with breast cancer research. Now, in 1992, Julie Crone became the first woman to ride in the Kentucky Oaks. She finished third on a long shot. In 2012, Rosie Napravnik wanted aboard a filly very appropriately named Believe You Can. 2 years later, she also won with Untappable. She's the only woman to have ridden an Oaks winner, but I'm sure there will be more on down the line since we have some very good young female jockeys out there. And this is our current reigning king of Oaks trainers. This is Dwayne Lucas. He's tied Woody Stevenson's record in 2022. The Secret Oath, he has a filly running on Friday named Lemon Muffin. She'll be a long shot, but if she wins, he will hold the title of the winningest Oaks trainer of all time. If Todd Pletcher wins with Leslie Rose, he will tie Lucas and Stevens with 5 wins each. So that is where we are. The Kentucky Oaks has grown from a little regional race all the way up to being one of the top 5 races in the country by attendance and by TV coverage. It's a huge fashion and charity gala as well as a horse race, and it's a celebration of Kentucky, fillies, lilies, and all things feminine. And that's pretty much what I have to say here, so I'm willing to take questions from the floor.
Which of the fillies winners of the Oaks has sired the most, either Derby winners or Oaks winners?
Okay, there are only 2 winners of the Kentucky Oaks who have either produced an Oaks winner or produced a Derby winner. Blue Delight holds the record on the Oaks. She produced 3, and that was Real Delight, Bubbly, and Princess Turia, as I showed her. The other filly who has done very well in that department was Princess Turia, one of the trio of sisters out of Blue Delight. She produced Forward Pass, who was the winner of the Kentucky Derby by disqualification. And there is something else in that Sweet Alliance, who won the Oaks and during the 1980s became the dam of, I believe it was Sharif Dancer, and he won the Irish Derby overseas.
Yes, great program. I'm interested that the older racers would race 95 races in their season, 100 races. Now,
Mhm.
if they race 8 or 10, it's a big time for current owner. What's happening to the breeds?
Part of it, I think, is changes in training techniques and owners' goals. I don't know that Thoroughbred has really changed all that tremendously. I mean, you can go back to, oh, for instance, Susan's girl who raced in the 1970s and was a Hooper bred. And she raced over 60 times herself and said ran for 4 years. She was injured at 5, but made a remarkable comeback as a 6-year-old. But I think part of the problem is that we don't have too many of the old sportsman owners around. They could afford to give a horse, as they called it, tincture of time. And when a horse, they stopped on it, they weren't necessarily in a hurry to hustle them off to the breeding shed too, because they were staying within these owners' private. Hooper was like that. Horses were very sound. They ran all over the place. But when you get to the later years, the sales industry has blossomed. It's a huge marketplace. Well, what are you going to do if your filly or mare wins the Oaks? She might earn another million or two racing if she stays at the top level, but she might throw foals worth 10 times that during her career. The incentive is to go ahead and retire her and get as many foals out of her as you can for the sales. The other thing is that people are just more cautious with their horses than they used to be. When you look at some of the great champions of the 1930s, for instance, Equipoise, 20 grand, they raced with injuries that would probably get you an outcry from the animal rights people these days. Fortunately, they survived. Old Rosebud, who raced in the 1914 Derby and won off in that, made two major comebacks to racing. It took him 3 years to come back from one of them, but what are you going to do with him? The horse is a gelding. He had no stud value. So he came back to racing. He was champion as a 6-year-old, got hurt again, made another comeback, and unfortunately succumbed to injury suffered during training. Again, would somebody have brought him back after the second breakdown in this day and time? I don't know if they would have brought him down at the first one. They'd have been yelling for him to be retired to the Kentucky Horse Park or Old Friends or something. So attitudes were different then, training methods were different. And owners' attitudes were different, partly because you had less of the people who were running it pretty strictly as a business and more people who were running it basically for their pleasure, for the sporting pleasure of it. Anyone else?
What's your prediction for this year's Oaks?
I knew somebody was going to hit me with that. I change my mind about every 10 minutes. I can tell you up front that I have never bought a ticket to play a horse in my life. So asking me for gambling advice is about like asking a nun how to jazz up your sex life. But right now, I would say probably the most consistent filly in the lot is Tarifa, the Godolphin entry. She's going to be probably the favorite, if not that. The filly that's racked up the highest speed figures is Torpedo Ann, who absolutely demolished things in the fantasy stakes. She'll have a lot of backing. Leslie's Rose from the Ashland is Todd Pletcher's entry in this. She's also going to be one of the top entries in this. Just as a sentimental choice, I'd like to see 1 or 2 fillies win. One is Lemon Muffin. That's Dwayne Lucas's entry because that would give him number 6 in the tops of all time. And he helped me quite a bit in putting this book together. And the other one would be Fiona's Magic, and you will not have heard of her. She's a Florida bred. She won the Devona Dale Stakes back there, and that was enough to get her in there. She'll probably be racing toward the front end early. I don't expect to see her win, but I know some folks back in Florida that will be doing absolute handsprings if she does.
Other than speed and the level of competition and the obvious factors, is there anything that goes into the decision about racing a filly in the Oaks versus the Derby?
One of the big things that several owners have mentioned is that the Derby routinely draws an absolutely huge field. The Oaks field is not small. It's capped at 14. But the Derby field is capped at 20, and it can be a right rodeo getting from the starting gate to the first turn. And a number of owners who have had fillies they thought might be prospects for this have said, nope, I think the odds of my filly getting hurt in that scrum are a bit too high. And that was one reason I think why Rachel Alexandra ran in the Oaks instead of the Preakness. And granted, the owner she had at the time of her Oaks win didn't really like the idea of racing colts anyway. And then she was sold in between the Derby and the Preakness, and that's how she ended up running in the Preakness. The Preakness, you usually have like a 10 or 11 horse field, maybe less. And fillies have been a little bit more willing to try that in recent years. But the other thing is that since the Oaks now carries a pretty high purse of its own, while it's not up to the Derby standards, I believe it's carrying a 1.5 million purse this year. That's not chicken feed. And if you've got a filly that you think is pretty capable of whipping her own sex, you know, granted, the purse is bigger at the Derby, the prestige is bigger. But at the end of the day, a Derby win won't necessarily get you any more at the auction block than an Oaks win will when it comes to the November sales.
Anybody else? Well, thank you so much. Could we have another round?